what else I have. My count is going to be great. I'll give this to Phyllis, just to be fair. I have some visual aids as well, which I promise I'll hold up for those of you in the back of the room that might not otherwise be able to see them. As we get started, fellow Toastmasters, I'd like you to answer a simple question for me. And by show of hands, when you have the answer, let me know. When you consider in your mind the front and rear flippers of a penguin, which are longer? Raise your hand when you have the answer. Still thinking? That many of you, really? Okay. Okay, well, whether you answered front or rear is really of less importance to me than what you were picturing at the time. And I'm guessing that most of you had to imagine something like this before you were able to answer. And my point is that we're all visual creatures, we all think visually, and whether we know it or not, we're calling these images up in our mind, we're responding to visual stimulation constantly in our environment. It's part of what is described in the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell as an adaptive unconscious. And the adaptive unconscious is like this wonderful supercomputer in our heads that allows us to function on a higher level while all of this other data is controlled by a visual valet. And that visual valet is what I want to discuss with you today. Because sometimes it can be wrong, and sometimes it can be right. But we're making these decisions just really super fast all the time. Let's look at a couple examples. And I think we'll find this to be valuable because the visual valet, it's always working whether we're in a job interview, talking to a candidate, or being interviewed as a candidate. If we're looking at something new, an idea that we haven't considered before. It also comes up when you're under a lot of stress. Like if you're in a street and a car is bearing down on you, you don't stop to consider, what should I rationally do? You just jump out of the way. And what animals would be, you should be squeaking me for that, I'm sure. I'll squeak myself. Animals call it instinct, and people we call it intuition. But it's still the same thing. It's this visual valet working on our peripheral, helping us to make decisions. Let's consider some examples. I made them nice and big so everyone in the room could see. This object is an office chair circa 1980, 1970, 1960, all the way back to the 50s. It's an overstuffed behemoth that was not very comfortable to sit in, but exuded power. The folks at Herman Miller, a team led by a designer named Bill Stumpf, in 1994 set out to redesign this chair. And from the ground up, they redesigned it in a big way to look like this. This is the Aeron chair, and it was universally panned by everyone that saw it at the time. You might remember, if you were around, that it wasn't until architects, engineers, and dot-com millionaires started to put their butts in this that it really took off as a product. The reason people visually rejected it is because, by comparison to this earlier design, it looks like some kind of arachnid, some kind of nasty thing that would be a torture device. The reason being all the mechanics were clearly visible underneath this thin mesh that was stretched. Aeron comes from the word aerate. That's how they named it, if you were wondering. So in this case, our visual decision-making was a little off because this looked so different from what anybody had seen before. We concluded that it would be a bad thing. On the other hand, visual cues can be very accurate and very helpful. If over the last month you received a lot of these at your door, presents and boxes and things, you probably wondered what was inside it until December 24th when you had the opportunity to open it. My guess is that if the same box arrived and it looked like this, you'd reach some immediate conclusions about the value of the items within, just based on the Tiffany blue exterior that's come to be synonymous with expensive luxury goods. Not many of these around my house this year. But the interesting thing to consider is that, do we do the same thing to people in other environments? If we see a superficial exterior, are quick decisions reached? And the answer is unequivocally yes. If you look at the psychology around speed dating, 6 or 7 minutes to decide if you want to spend more time with someone, the sad truth is that most people only need a few seconds. How cruel would that be? Really, you can hold up a picture and people can conclude whether they want to spend more time with that person. Now, there is a psychological theory going on around this too, that if you ask those same people to describe what characteristics they want in a spouse, force them to write it down, then it becomes much more difficult for them to actually make that match between the physical, visual attributes of someone they see and what they're telling you that they want. That's due to a psychological process called verbal overshadowing. Verbal overshadowing can be proven, I think, in a quick riddle. I'll ask you guys to respond to this riddle again with show of hands when you have the answer. A father and son are in an automobile accident, a serious one. The father is killed, the son is rushed to the emergency room. The attending doctor looks at the child and says, "This child is my son." Who is the doctor? Who is the doctor?
Doctor is the child's mother.
That's right. That's true. But amazingly, some people have a hard time with the insight because we've been preconditioned to think of doctors as a male role, maybe middle-aged. So we fight against the visual impressions that we have, and that's called verbal overshadowing. It happens very often. So here's my point. Visuals need context to really have meaning. They work on a conscious and an unconscious level. I can prove, I think, in a couple quick examples, how I can use visuals to read your minds. So I'm going to ask for a little more audience participation. Would anybody like to help me? Thank you very much. Thank you. Can you name for me a number between 1 and 100?
Yes.
Share it with the audience.
77.
77. That's a great number. Just so happens, this is the Chinese character for 77. Ladies and gentlemen. One more example. I need someone, maybe a skeptic. Skeptic in the audience?
You got a lot of them now.
Okay.
Name for the audience, please, a breakfast cereal.
Rice Krispies.
Rice Krispies. You sure? Ladies and gentlemen, the UPC code for Rice Krispies. The power of visual communication. As you leave here, I just want to challenge you. Think about how consciously and unconsciously visual cues influence your decision making every day. For better or for worse, it's happening, and I thank you for your time.